Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 18 of my Lancastrians and Yorkists vlog. And this time we're going to be thinking about the threats to Henry VII's reign and trying to assess how serious they were. So first of all, there were basically four sources of opposition to Henry VII. Number one, Yorkist hardliners. Lovell is an example of that. Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, he was imprisoned but released at the end of 1485. Surrey, perhaps, who fought with Richard III at Bosworth, he's kept in prison until 1489. Lovell's really the only one that emerges as a significant threat there, I would say. Secondly, Yorkist claimants to the throne, Edward, Earl of Warwick, who was Clarence's son, Richard III's nephew, and Lincoln as well, who we'll talk about in a moment. Third, Irish lords who were used to semi-independence, had been gained under Yorkist rule and resented Tudor imposition of lordship over them. And fourth, Margaret of Burgundy, the sister of Edward IV and Richard III, and arch plotter over there on the continent. So let's have a look at some rebellions and we'll kind of rate them as we go. The first one to hatch was Lovell's rebellion in 1486. It's a year after the Battle of Bosworth. Francis, Viscount Lovell, had been a close supporter of Richard III. He had fought for Richard at Bosworth and had been attainted afterwards, losing all his lands. And he and the Stafford brothers, Humphrey Stafford and Thomas Stafford, tried to foster some rebellion in Yorkshire, that was Lovell, and the West Midlands, that's Stafford. But they really get very little traction from there. And they don't get any kind of support from the Northern Lords, which they'd been hoping for as well. And so when Henry VII arrived to deal with all this in York on the 20th of April 1486, the rebels flee away. Lovell legs it to Burgundy to see Margaret over there. Humphrey Stafford was executed. Thomas Stafford was pardoned and was loyal thereafter. So rebellion number one, not a super serious threat really. The guys trying to engineer it are not really claimants to the throne. The lack of support they get shows that either that people were pro-Henry or they were fed up with the turmoil of new kingships and fighting. Perhaps a bit of both. Now, before we talk about Lambert Simnel, let's just digress a little bit to consider kind of foreign policy things. Polydore Virgil, who wrote at this time, said Henry VII was more inclined to peace than to war. Kind of a sort of a passive-aggressive compliment, I suppose. But this is worth remembering. Henry VII was focused on securing the throne and stabilising his finances, and this meant particularly early on that he's very conciliatory in his foreign policy, seeing that as part of the bigger picture of trying to establish himself and his dynasty. Therefore, straight away gets on the throne. He immediately negotiated a one-year truce with France. That was extended to 1489, so that's 3 more years, 4 years in total. He agreed a 3-year truce with Scotland. He agreed a commercial agreement with Brittany, both of those in 1486. And in 1487, he negotiated a 1-year peace treaty with Maximilian, King of the Romans, the heir to the Holy Roman Empire throne. Implicitly, this meant that France, Scotland, Scotland, Brittany, and Maximilian, King of the Romans, all accepted Henry VII as king, which is really important to him. It gives him legitimacy, and it only leaves Burgundy as a kind of an outlier who could be fostering resentment against him, and Spain, who are a bit further away. And in any case, he's launching into marriage negotiations with Spain quite early on in his reign too. So that leads us nicely into the exciting story of Lambert Simnel and the rebellion of the Earl of Lincoln. This is 1486 to 87. Once Henry VII had claimed the throne at the Battle of Bosworth, he put Edward, Earl of Warwick, who was the son of Clarence, George Duke of Clarence, the nephew then of both Edward IV and Richard III, and the closest male contender to the throne. He was 10 years old in 1485. He was placed immediately in the Tower of London. John de la Pole, the Earl of Lincoln, had been Richard III's cousin and officially his heir after the death of Richard's son Edward in 1484. But both he and his dad the Duke of Suffolk, claimed loyalty to Henry VII, and they were allowed to remain at large doing their thing. However, in 1486, rumours started spreading that Edward, Earl of Warwick, had escaped, and there were even some rumours that Clarence had swapped Edward for another child before he died and had sent Edward to Ireland for his safety. These kind of two rumours coalesce in February 1487 when Lambert Simnel appeared in Ireland and claimed to be Edward, or some accounts have him claiming to be Richard of York, the younger of the two princes in town. But let's go with Edward. Simnel was probably from Oxford and has probably been put up to it by a priest called Simons, who's a Yorkist sympathiser. But let that kind of drift by. It's significant that Simnel gains decent support amongst Irish lords, for example, Thomas Fitzgerald, the Chancellor of Ireland, Gerald Fitzgerald, the Earl of Kildare, and Walter Fitzsimmons, the Archbishop of Dublin. As I mentioned earlier, the Irish were used to their kind of semi-independence and were seeing Simnel as a way of regaining that, or perhaps even furthering that. Anyway, in response, Henry VII did the obvious and logical thing, which was to bring out the real Edward, Earl of Warwick, and parade him through the streets of London, showing everyone that actually Lambert Simnel could only be an impostor. But, raising the stakes in response to that, John de la Pole, the Earl of Lincoln, cousin of Richard and cousin of Edward, said publicly that Simnel was the real Edward and headed straight to Antwerp to the loving embrace of Margaret of Burgundy, who gave him support, cobbled together some funds for German mercenaries, and dispatched Lincoln and Francis Viscount Lovell, of previous rebellion fame, to Ireland in April 1487. Once they arrived, Simnel was crowned Edward IV in Dublin, and in June 1487 they invaded England with about 1,500 German mercenaries, about 4,000 lightly armed Irish light infantry. Unfortunately for them, there was quite limited support from England, apart from the Scrope family, who you might remember from way back, rebelling against Henry IV. And Henry VII met them at Stoke on the 16th of June 1487. He had a bigger army, probably 12,000 against probably 8,000. He had good archers. The Irish soldiers were quite lightly protected, as I said, and Henry VII wins the battle pretty straightforwardly. Lincoln was killed in the battle. Lovell escaped to Scotland. We don't really hear from him again. Simnel was captured and given a job in Henry VII's kitchens, which was both merciful and also quite clever, wasn't it? Every time there was sort of any doubt about who was in charge, Henry can bring out Simnel from the kitchens and say, look at this kid that everyone thought was a claimant to the throne. Simnel later becomes a falconer, incidentally. 28 nobles who were fought at Stoke were attainted when Parliament met in 1487. The important thing for us is, how big a threat is this? Well, clearly the Irish lords, it's a bad thing that they're rebelling, Margaret of Burgundy scheming in the background, but really the fact that this doesn't get any traction in England is significant, I think. And we can say that this, on the seriousness scale, this is not that serious. It's pretty straightforwardly ended. Stepping up another notch, though, I would say, is the conspiracy of Perkin Warbeck, which William Stanley gets himself caught up in. This runs from 1491 to 1497, which in itself shows that it's a more serious thorn in Henry's side. So in the early 1490s, Perkin Warbeck visited Cork in southwest Ireland and was persuaded whilst there to impersonate Richard of York, the younger prince in the Tower. Immediately, this is a cleverer move because Richard is dead, almost certainly, and certainly Henry VII doesn't have him under control, so he can't bring him out to disprove this claim. It's worth sort of saying here that, just a bit of a digression to foreign policy, in 1487, France had threatened Brittany. Brittany was independent at this time, and France wanted to take it over. Henry VII, for all sorts of reasons, wanted Brittany to remain independent. He sends over a few kind of volunteers to help out the Duke of Brittany, and also tries to mediate between the Bretons and the French. That was not all that successful, probably because of the Bretons, really. And in 1498, France defeated Brittany in battle, and a treaty was signed between the two, which said the Duke of Brittany's daughter and heir, Anne, would only marry with the agreements of France. Duke of Brittany then dies pretty much straight afterwards, and the King of France takes Anne off to France to make sure that she only marries when he's good and ready to. Henry VII takes umbrage at this and gets together an alliance of Brittany, Maximilian, King of the Romans, and Spain to resist a French takeover, full French takeover of Brittany. But Maximilian is just a bit flaky. The Bretons actually gave up in 1498 and agreed that Anne would marry Charles V of France. Henry wants to just sort of see things through a little bit. He's already committed to raising an army and going off to France. Now, Charles, the King of France, initially wants to distract Henry VII from this invasion of Brittany, and so he invites Perkin Warbeck to his court. By mid-1492, 100 Yorkists had joined him there, but this kind of backfires on him, really, that Henry sees essentially as an opportunity to put pressure on France rather than feeling the pressure the other way around. And so in October 1492, Henry VII lands an army in France, and the French are very keen to avoid a war. Possibly, some people say, it was not really a very realistic invasion because October is not really the time to invade because it's winter. Anyhow, within a couple of weeks, the whole thing's sorted out. A treaty is signed at Etaples, probably, Etaples, under which France agreed to give up any English rebels or not support any further English rebels, and to pay Henry VII 50,000 crowns a year, which amounted to about 5% of Henry's annual income. In return, France would get to keep Brittany. This then meant that Perkin Warbeck was expelled from France and fled to, drumroll please, Margaret of Burgundy. In response to this, Henry VII suspended trade with Burgundy in 1493, but that damaged both sides. There were unemployment and riots in the streets of London. Margaret didn't care anyway, so that doesn't work. Warbeck actually gets the support from Maximilian, King of the Romans, who for some reason fallen out with he's fallen out with Henry VII because of Henry VII's now treaty with France, and Maximilian doesn't like the French. Then the conspiracy kind of gathers pace. In 1494-95, Sir Robert Clifford, who was either a spy all along or just ended up betraying the conspirators, named some names in England that were betraying Henry over this thing. The most significant of these was Sir William Stanley. Sir William Stanley was the Chamberlain of England and the brother of Henry VII's stepfather, Thomas Stanley, as well as having played that crucial role at the Battle of Bosworth. Nevertheless, he was tried and executed in February 1495. Up to this stage, we're going to run out of time in a minute, so let's just tie this in. Up to this stage, the Perkin Warbeck conspiracy has been running for 4 years. And this in itself, as I said, already showed it's a more serious player than Lambert Simnel or the Lovell Rebellion. It's not necessarily gathering widespread support in England, but William Stanley is an important figure. And he says, something like, if I had known for sure that this Perkin Warbeck wasn't Richard of York, I would never have got involved. But there's that element of doubt and that element of suspicion that perhaps this is somebody who has survived and fled. And that just means that Henry VII is really, really, really eager to stamp this out. I think you can see in the way that Henry reacts to Perkin Warbeck kind of swanning around the continent, that he himself takes this one a little more seriously. Next time, we'll see how Perkin Warbeck comes to a sticky end, and we'll look at perhaps the two rebellions in Yorkshire and Cornwall as well to wrap up Henry VII. See you then.